welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Before we settle in, I'll gently invite you to leave a comment if you feel like it, just saying where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always quietly comforting to see how far these stories travel across the night. And as you do that, or even if you don't, you can let your attention slowly drift back to this moment as the light of day fades and we find ourselves standing just outside a Roman legion camp at dusk, the sun already low, the sky softening into muted tones of orange and grey, the heat of the day loosening its grip. And inside the camp there's no sense of urgency, no sudden commands, just a gradual slowing as soldiers finish the same familiar tasks they've done hundreds of times before. Because what really happened inside a Roman legion camp after dark was rarely dramatic and almost never heroic. It was methodical, repetitive, and quietly human. And as you step through the orderly entrance, past the shallow ditch and earthen wall that were rebuilt almost every evening no matter how long the march had been, you notice how the camp itself feels less like a temporary stop and more like a place that expects to exist, with straight roads crossing at right angles, tents aligned with careful precision, and everything arranged in a way that would look nearly identical whether this camp stood in Britain, Gaul, the Danube frontier, or the edge of the eastern deserts. And this sameness wasn't accidental, it was intentional, because familiarity calmed the mind. And for Roman soldiers, many of whom had been away from home for years, predictability mattered more than comfort. And as the light fades further, the sounds of the camp soften, metal tools are set down, leather straps loosened, armour eased off shoulders that have learned the exact weight of it, and there's a subtle shift in the air as the working day ends, not with a signal or a speech, but with quiet understanding. The kind that only comes from routine, and nearby a pair of soldiers move slowly as they wipe dust from shields, not because they expect to fight tonight, but because cleaning gear was simply what one did at this hour, every hour like it. And farther along the road, small cooking fires begin to glow, kept deliberately low, as they almost always were, because bright flames were unnecessary and discouraged, and the smell of simple food grain, maybe a thin stew, drifts gently through the rows of tents. And it's worth pausing here to understand something that often surprises people, which is that Roman soldiers spent far more time building camps, cooking meals, repairing equipment, and waiting than they ever did fighting. And for many of them, nights like this one made up the vast majority of their military experience. Ordinary nights where nothing happened, where the most important task was simply maintaining order and preparing to do it all again tomorrow. And as the last daylight slips away, conversations grow quieter but don't disappear. They never really do. They just become softer, more repetitive. Stories told before and told again. Observations about the march, the weather, the food, the same familiar complaints delivered without real frustration, more as ritual than protest. And somewhere nearby, a soldier dictates a short letter to a friend who happens to be more comfortable with writing, because not everyone could read or write easily. And the words are simple, unremarkable, the kind that mention health, distance, and time passing. And as darkness settles more fully over the camp, the straight roads that seemed so clear in daylight now become gentle corridors of shadow, still navigable, still familiar, because everyone knows exactly where they lead, and that knowledge brings a quiet ease. And while it's tempting to imagine tension or fear creeping in with the night, the truth is that for seasoned soldiers, nighttime often felt calmer than the day. Fewer orders, fewer movements, fewer demands, and the camp takes on a steady rhythm, one that has been repeated night after night across the empire, with guards quietly preparing for watch rotations, others settling near their tents, cloaks folded or draped close at hand, And above it all, there's no sense of spectacle, no sense that this night is special or different. And that's precisely the point, because the strength of the Roman army didn't come from constant action, but from this kind of order, this steady, predictable unwinding of the day. And as you remain here, listening to the low murmur of voices and the soft crackle of small fires, you begin to understand that what really happened inside a Roman legion camp after dark was not a story of danger or drama, but one of routine carefully maintained, of thousands of ordinary nights stitched together to support something much larger. And as the camp continues to settle, with the sky now fully dark and the sounds growing fewer, this ordinary night carries on, calm, unremarkable, and quietly enduring, just as it has so many times before. As the camp settles deeper into night, the importance of its design becomes clearer in a way that daylight never fully reveals, because a Roman legion camp was not simply arranged for efficiency, but for comprehension, built so that even when shadows lengthened and sight became unreliable, movement through the space still felt natural and unforced. And at the heart of the camp, two broad roads crossed at right angles, wide enough for groups of soldiers to pass without crowding, their surfaces worn smooth by countless boots. And these roads divided the camp into sections so familiar that many soldiers could navigate them in near darkness without conscious thought, turning left or right by instinct alone, guided by memory rather than signs or commands. And this was no coincidence, because Roman military planners understood something subtle about the human mind, which was that anxiety grows in unfamiliar spaces, especially at night. And so they removed uncertainty wherever they could, repeating the same layout again and again across vast distances, until the pattern itself became a kind of mental anchor. And whether the camp stood on a grassy plain, a rocky hillside, or the edge of a forest, the internal geography remained almost unchanged. The headquarters always near the centre, the officers' quarters arranged in predictable positions, storage areas placed where everyone expected them to be, and rows of tents aligned with careful precision, not for beauty but for recognition. And for a soldier who had marched all day, perhaps for weeks, this recognition mattered more than comfort, because knowing exactly where you were, even half awake, allowed the mind to rest. And as you move slowly along one of these roads now, you notice how the ground itself seems to guide your steps, cleared of loose stones and debris during construction, packed down firmly, edged by shallow drainage trenches that serve their purpose quietly, channeling water away when needed. And even now, underfoot, the earth feels intentional, shaped by habit and foresight. And around you, tents rise in orderly rows, each one nearly identical to the next, their canvas surfaces darkened in the low light, entrances facing the same direction, spaced evenly, so that no one feels crowded, yet no space is wasted. And this uniformity extended to nearly every aspect of camp life, from where soldiers slept to where equipment was stored. And while modern imagination sometimes sees this as rigid or impersonal, for those living within it, the predictability offered relief, especially at night, when fatigue made even small decisions feel heavy. And here, decisions were largely unnecessary, because the camp made them for you, guiding movement, behavior, and expectation, without the need for constant supervision. And this is where discipline in the Roman army often expressed itself most effectively, not through shouting or punishment, but through environment, through spaces designed so well that order maintained itself almost automatically. And even now, as voices lower and activity slows, you can sense how the layout quietly enforces calm, discouraging, wandering, encouraging stillness, making it easier for thousands of individuals to coexist without friction. And it's worth noting that these camps were not permanent installations during campaigns. They were temporary, rebuilt again and again, sometimes every single night, even when armies advanced only short distances. And while this required effort, it also created continuity, because the act of building the camp followed the same sequence each time: trenches dug to a standard depth, earth piled into embankments, entrances positioned with care, and tents raised according to established order. And by the time night arrived, the camp already felt familiar, even if the land beneath it was new. And this familiarity reduced fear, not because danger was absent, but because uncertainty was minimized. And as you continue to stand within this quiet geometry, you may notice how movement through the camp has slowed to a near stillness, with only the occasional figure passing along a road, footsteps soft, unhurried, each person seeming to know exactly where they are going. And this sense of collective awareness was one of the Roman army's greatest strengths, because it allowed large numbers of people to function smoothly without constant instruction. And at night, when visibility dropped and energy waned, this mattered more than ever. And even the guards, who would soon begin their watches, relied on this structure, using landmarks they could sense rather than see, counting steps, noting the position of tents, listening for familiar sounds. And the camp itself responded to the night by growing quieter but not uneasy, holding its shape as naturally as a well-practiced routine. And in this way, the Roman legion camp after dark becomes less a place of tension and more a place of quiet assurance, where order persists not through force but through design, where the very arrangement of space encourages calm, and where thousands of ordinary nights pass in much the same way, steady, predictable, and unremarkable, supporting an empire not through drama but through consistency. As the evening continues to settle over the camp, the work that fills these hours is unhurried and methodical, shaped less by urgency than by habit. And for the soldiers, this period between the end of marching and the beginning of full darkness is often the most familiar part of the day, because it follows a sequence they know almost without thinking, beginning with the quiet removal of equipment that has been worn for hours, sometimes since before sunrise. Armour eased from tired shoulders, belts loosened, sandals unlaced and set carefully aside, not tossed or forgotten, because every piece has its place and will be needed again soon enough. And nearby, shields are leaned against tent posts, their surfaces wiped clean of dust, not because they must look impressive, but because dirt left to settle can weaken materials over time. And Roman soldiers were taught early on that small neglect accumulated into larger problems, and so cleaning became less of a chore and more of a reflex, something done while thinking about other things, or nothing at all. And as hands move over familiar shapes of wood and metal, conversations begin and fade without ceremony, often between men who have shared years of service together and no longer feel the need to fill silence. And when they do speak, it is rarely about the future in grand terms, but about the immediate and the ordinary, how far they marched that day, the condition of the road, the weight of the pack, the quality of the water, the sameness of the bread. And these conversations repeat themselves night after night, not because they lack imagination, but because repetition itself offers comfort, a way of marking time without effort. And for many soldiers, these quiet exchanges are as important as rest, providing a sense of belonging that grows slowly over months and years. And nearby, small groups gather around low fires to prepare the evening meal, which is simple by design, often grain-based, sometimes supplemented with vegetables or a bit of meat if supplies allow. And while modern depictions often imagine Roman soldiers feasting, the reality is much more restrained. Meals intended to sustain rather than impress, and eaten slowly, with little ceremony, bowls passed hand to hand, portions measured, not out of strictness, but practicality, because food supplies must last, and excess now creates scarcity later. And as they eat, the sounds of the camp soften further. Metal clinks become less frequent, footsteps slow, and the overall rhythm shifts toward rest. And it's during these moments that you begin to notice how the camp functions almost without direction, because everyone knows what is expected, and no one needs to be reminded loudly. And this absence of raised voices is not accidental. Roman officers discouraged unnecessary noise in the evening, not because silence was demanded, but because calm helped maintain order, and as a result, instructions are passed quietly, corrections made gently, and disputes, when they arise at all, are usually settled with a few words rather than confrontation. And within the tents themselves, the atmosphere grows quieter still, as soldiers arrange their limited personal belongings, folding cloaks, adjusting bedrolls, setting aside items they may need during the night. And while space is shared, it is respected, boundaries understood through long familiarity. And it's here that some soldiers take out small personal objects, charms, tokens from home, items that have travelled with them across provinces, not displayed openly, but handled privately, offering a brief connection to places far away. And others take advantage of the lingering light to tend to their feet, cleaning them carefully, because foot health was essential in an army that marched constantly, and small injuries ignored could quickly become debilitating, and these acts of care are performed quietly, without comment, a reminder that survival in this environment depends less on bravery than on attention to detail. And nearby, someone recites a familiar story, perhaps one that has been told many times before, and while no one listens closely, the sound of the voice itself becomes part of the background, steady and unremarkable, blending with the soft crackle of fires and the occasional call of a distant animal beyond the camp's perimeter. And as the light fades further, writing materials appear in a few hands, thin wooden tablets coated with wax, or scraps of parchment if available, and letters are composed slowly, sometimes dictated aloud, because literacy varied widely. And what matters most is not elegant phrasing, but the act of reaching out. And these letters are brief, focused on reassurance rather than detail, mentions of health, of continued service, of time passing, and they are folded and set aside carefully to be sent when opportunity arises. And all the while, the camp remains remarkably calm, not because danger is impossible, but because this time of day is dedicated to slowing down, and soldiers understand that conserving energy is as important as exerting it. And as night deepens, the final tasks are completed, fires dimmed further, equipment set in its place, and the camp settles into a state that is neither fully asleep nor fully awake, a kind of shared pause, where movement continues but at a reduced pace, and for many soldiers, this is the moment when fatigue finally surfaces, not as discomfort, but as a gentle heaviness, a signal that it is time to rest. And yet, even now, there is no rush, no abrupt end to activity, because everything in the Roman camp follows a gradual curve rather than a sharp edge, easing from one state into another. And this gradual transition is one of the reasons the camp feels so stable, night after night, because nothing changes suddenly. And as you remain within this space, observing the slow work of evening, you begin to see how these ordinary actions, repeated countless times across years of service, shape not only the daily rhythm of the camp, but the mindset of the soldiers themselves, teaching patience, attentiveness, and acceptance, qualities that rarely appear in heroic accounts, but which quietly sustained one of the most enduring military systems in history. And as the last traces of daylight disappear and the first watch prepares to take over, the camp completes its shift into night, calm, organized, and unremarkable, ready to hold its steady form through the dark hours ahead. As full night settles in and the camp's activity slows even further, the presence of food and fire becomes quietly central to how these hours unfold, not as moments of celebration, but as anchors of routine that mark the transition from work to rest. And it's worth lingering here, because what Roman soldiers ate, how they prepared it, and the rules surrounding even a small cooking fire reveal far more about daily military life than most battle accounts ever do. And at this hour, the fires are deliberately modest, kept low and controlled, partly to conserve fuel, partly to avoid drawing attention, but also because Roman camps were organized to reduce unnecessary risk. And open flames, while comforting, were also carefully managed, often positioned in designated areas rather than scattered freely among tents. And the soldiers preparing food now do so with movements that suggest long familiarity, grinding grain if it hasn't already been prepared, heating water slowly, stirring simple mixtures that resemble porridge more than anything modern audiences might expect, because the foundation of a Roman soldier's diet was grain, usually wheat, issued regularly and expected to be processed by the soldiers themselves, which meant that evenings often included this quiet labour, hands working stone grinders in steady, circular motions, not rushed, not complained about, just done, because it was understood that nourishment was a shared responsibility. And while meat did appear in the diet, it was far less frequent than popular imagination suggests, often preserved rather than fresh, and consumed in small portions when available, supplemented by vegetables, legumes, or whatever could be sourced locally without disrupting supply lines. And this reliance on simple, repeatable meals was intentional because complex food systems created dependency, and dependency made armies fragile. And as soldiers eat now, seated on the ground or low stools, bowls balanced easily, there's little ceremony, no formal order, just an understanding that everyone eats, cleans up, and moves on. And food here is not entertainment, it's maintenance, a way of keeping the body steady for another day of marching, digging, and waiting. And the fires themselves serve multiple purposes beyond cooking, offering warmth as the air cools, especially in northern provinces or during colder seasons. And while cloaks provide insulation, the brief comfort of heat draws small groups together, not in tight circles, but loosely, with enough space to avoid crowding. And conversations around these fires tend to be subdued, often drifting into silence, because hunger quiets the mind at first, and fatigue follows close behind. And it's here that you might notice another unfamiliar detail of Roman camp life, which is that alcohol, while present, was usually diluted and consumed in moderation, most often in the form of wine mixed heavily with water, a practice that reduced intoxication and dehydration. And drunkenness was discouraged not through constant punishment, but through expectation, because loss of control disrupted the order that everyone depended on. And so drinking, when it happened, was woven into the evening gently, without emphasis, and as meals finish, utensils are cleaned carefully, fires adjusted lower still, embers spread to maintain warmth without flame, and the camp's lighting becomes softer, uneven, pockets of glow surrounded by deep shadow. And this low light changes how time feels, slowing perception, encouraging stillness. And it's during this phase of the night that boredom often settles in, not as restlessness, but as a quiet absence of stimulation, and Roman soldiers were intimately familiar with boredom, more so than fear, because long stretches of military life involved waiting without clear purpose, and rather than resisting this, many learned to accept it, allowing their minds to drift, replaying familiar thoughts, noticing small sensations, the warmth of the fire, the weight of the cloak, the distant sounds beyond the camp, and boredom, in this sense, becomes a tool, dulling sharp edges of worry and anticipation. And as fires continue to dim, some soldiers adjust their positions, shifting closer to their tents, preparing mentally for rest, even if sleep will not come immediately. And the camp at this hour feels suspended, no longer fully active, not yet quiet enough to be asleep. And this in-between state is one that Roman camps experienced night after night, forming a consistent backdrop to service. And it's also during this time that practical considerations quietly shape behaviour, because fires must be extinguished or reduced enough to prevent accidents. Tents made of canvas and leather were vulnerable to sparks, and so fire safety was a constant concern, addressed not through fear, but through habit, each person knowing when to step away, when to stir embers, when to let heat fade, and these habits were passed down informally, learned by observation rather than instruction, and as the hours pass, the camp grows darker, but not uncomfortable, because the absence of light signals rest, and rest is valued here not as indulgence, but as preparation, and in this low-lit environment, movement becomes slower, more deliberate, footsteps softer, voices rare, and the fires that remain serve less as gathering points and more as quiet markers of presence, small signs that life continues even as the day recedes. And it's important to understand that for many soldiers, evenings like this offered a sense of control that the battlefield never could, because within the camp, systems worked, supplies were counted, tasks completed, and the uncertainty of the wider world felt held at bay, at least temporarily. And as you remain here, observing these subdued moments of eating, warming, and waiting, it becomes clear that the Roman army's endurance depended not on constant readiness for violence, but on the careful management of ordinary needs, repeated calmly across thousands of nights. And as the last fires fade into embers and the final bowls are set aside, the camp moves another step closer to sleep, carrying with it the quiet satisfaction of routine fulfilled, and the long, uneventful hours before dawn stretch out ahead, steady and unremarkable, supported by the simple acts of food shared and fires tended with care. As the camp settles further into the night, attention shifts gently toward a responsibility that continues regardless of rest, one that unfolds quietly and predictably, and that is the system of night watches, which for Roman soldiers was far less dramatic than later stories often suggest, but far more structured and thoughtful than most people realize, because guarding a camp after dark was not about scanning the horizon for constant threats, but about maintaining rhythm, awareness, and continuity. And as the evening deepens, small groups of soldiers are selected for duty not at random, but according to a rotating schedule that ensured fairness and prevented exhaustion. And this schedule was carefully recorded earlier in the day, often using simple tokens or written lists, so that no one was surprised when their turn came. And this predictability mattered because it allowed soldiers to rest mentally even before they rested physically, knowing when they would sleep and when they would walk the perimeter. And as guards quietly rise and prepare, there is no announcement, no ceremony, just the soft sound of movement as cloaks are adjusted, sandals secured, weapons checked, not for combat readiness, but for familiarity, because guards relied more on recognition than reaction, and the camp itself supports them in this task, with its clear boundaries, shallow ditches, and earthen walls, forming gentle guides rather than obstacles. And walking along these edges at night feels less like patrolling and more like pacing a known path, one that has been traced many times before. And one of the lesser-known details of Roman night watches is that guards were trained to listen far more than they were trained to look, because darkness made vision unreliable, while sound carried easily, and soldiers learned to distinguish between the normal noises of the night, such as wind in trees, distant animals, or the shifting of canvas, and sounds that did not belong. And this skill developed slowly, sharpened by repetition, until a guard could recognize subtle changes without conscious effort. And to support this, the camp maintained a level of quiet that made listening possible, discouraging unnecessary movement and noise. And in this way, the entire camp participated in its own security, not through tension, but through stillness. And as guards walk their routes, they often do so in pairs or small groups, not because solitude was feared, but because shared presence helped maintain alertness during long, uneventful hours, and conversation, when it happens at all, is brief and functional, often limited to confirming time, position, or routine checks. And it's here that another unfamiliar aspect of Roman camp life emerges, which is the use of passwords, changed daily and communicated carefully to those on duty, not whispered dramatically, but passed along as part of routine procedure, ensuring that anyone moving through the camp at night could be identified without confusion. And this system reduced the likelihood of internal mistakes far more than it prevented external threats, because the greatest danger at night often came from misunderstanding rather than attack. And guards also carried simple signalling devices, not horns or alarms meant to startle, but tools designed to communicate quietly with officers if something seemed out of place, and most nights nothing did. And that was the expectation, because the purpose of the watch was not to confront danger, but to confirm normalcy, to ensure that the camp remained exactly as it should be. And as the hours pass, the guards' experience of time becomes stretched and uneven, marked not by events, but by the gradual cooling of the air, the slow movement of stars overhead, and the faint changes in sound that signal the progression of night. And during these hours, guards might reflect privately on their surroundings, noticing how the camp feels different from the day, less crowded, more expansive, even though nothing has physically changed. And this shift in perception is one reason night duty was considered both necessary and quietly taxing, because it required sustained attention without stimulation, a skill learned through practice rather than instruction. And to support this, watch shifts were kept deliberately limited in length, allowing soldiers to rotate through rest and duty without becoming overwhelmed. And when a shift ends, the transition is gentle, one guard quietly replacing another, a brief exchange of acknowledgement, and the path continues without interruption. And throughout all of this, officers remain present but unobtrusive, making occasional rounds not to intimidate, but to ensure that procedures are followed and that no one is struggling. And punishment for errors at night was less common than many imagine, because the Roman military understood that fear disrupted judgment, and calm consistency produced better results. And so corrections were usually delayed until morning, unless immediate action was required, reinforcing the idea that night was a time for maintenance, not conflict. And as the watches continue, the camp itself seems to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly as people shift, rest, and move, and guards become attuned to these rhythms, recognizing which sounds signal ordinary activity and which deserve attention. And this awareness extends beyond the camp's boundaries, as well as guards listen to the natural world outside, learning the patterns of local wildlife, the way wind moves through different landscapes, the sounds that belong and those that do not. And over time, this familiarity creates confidence, not the loud confidence of certainty, but the quiet confidence of recognition. And as the deepest part of the night approaches, guards often find that alertness comes more easily than expected, not because the mind is sharp, but because it has settled into the task, accepting the monotony as part of the role. And in this acceptance, there is a kind of calm focus that defines Roman night duty. And when dawn eventually approaches, the guards who have walked these slow paths will hand over their responsibilities without fanfare, returning to their tents not with stories of excitement, but with the quiet satisfaction that the night passed as it should have, uneventful, orderly, and intact. And in this way, the system of night watches reveals itself not as a dramatic safeguard against constant threat, but as another example of how the Roman army relied on routine, patience, and attention to the ordinary to sustain itself through countless nights, allowing most soldiers to rest while a few maintained the gentle, steady vigilance that kept the camp whole. As the night moves past its midpoint and the camp settles into its quietest hours, a different kind of awareness takes hold, one shaped less by activity and more by sound and absence. Because after midnight, the Roman camp enters a phase that many soldiers recognize immediately, even without checking the sky. A period when movement slows to a minimum and the world seems to narrow to what can be heard rather than seen. And it's during these hours that the camp's true nighttime character emerges, not tense or watchful in the dramatic sense, but subdued, layered with small, steady noises that blend into a kind of background rhythm. And if you were standing still now, allowing your attention to soften, you would begin to notice how sound travels differently at this time, how the scrape of a sandal on packed earth carries farther, how a cough from within a tent briefly feels amplified before fading back into silence, and how the canvas walls themselves respond to the night air, shifting gently as temperatures drop, producing soft, familiar creaks that soldiers learn to ignore almost entirely. And these sounds are not interruptions, they are markers, reminders that the camp is alive even while resting. And over time, soldiers become so accustomed to this soundscape that true silence would feel unsettling, because it would suggest something unnatural, and beyond the camp's perimeter, the natural world continues its own quiet routines, insects pulsing in steady patterns during warmer seasons, distant animals moving through the dark, wind passing through grass or trees depending on where the camp has been raised. And Roman soldiers, especially those who served long campaigns in the same region, became adept at recognizing these environmental sounds, distinguishing between what belonged to the landscape and what did not through conscious analysis, but through familiarity. And this familiarity extended even to weather, because subtle changes in sound often signaled shifts in wind or approaching rain, long before clouds could be seen. And within the camp itself, sleep during these hours is uneven, not everyone resting at once, because some remain on watch, others stir briefly, turning on bedrolls, adjusting cloaks, waking momentarily without fully surfacing into awareness. And this fragmented rest was expected, even accepted, because the Roman military understood that uninterrupted sleep was rare in camp life. And instead of resisting this, systems evolved around it, allowing soldiers to function effectively on partial rest accumulated over time. And it's here that one of the less discussed aspects of Roman discipline becomes clear, which is that endurance was cultivated not through extremes, but through consistency, and the body adapted gradually to these patterns of rest and wakefulness. And as the camp remains still, the sense of time becomes less precise, minutes blending into one another without clear markers, and for those awake, especially guards nearing the end of their shift, this stretching of time can feel both heavy and calming, because nothing demands immediate attention, and the mind, freed from tasks, drifts naturally, often returning to familiar thoughts, or simply observing sensations without judgment. And in this way, the deep night hours serve as a kind of mental reset, a space where thoughts slow and awareness softens, and within the tents, the shared nature of sleeping arrangements contributes to this atmosphere, because sounds made by one person ripple gently through the space, reminding others of presence without intrusion, and while privacy is limited, familiarity compensates, allowing soldiers to relax, knowing that those around them understand the rhythms of sleep, and interruptions are met with tolerance rather than frustration. And outside, the fires that once glowed warmly are now reduced to faint embers or extinguished entirely, leaving the camp illuminated only by moonlight or starlight, depending on the night. And this low level of light further encourages stillness, because movement becomes deliberate, measured, and rare. And it's worth noting that Roman camps were intentionally arranged to minimize unnecessary nighttime movement, with most needs anticipated and addressed before sleep, reducing the chance that someone would need to cross the camp unexpectedly. And this planning contributes to the calm of these hours, because predictability remains intact even when activity ceases. And for soldiers who have experienced many nights like this, the deep quiet carries a reassuring quality, signaling that the systems holding the camp together are functioning as intended. And, as the night progresses, subtle changes begin to occur, almost imperceptibly, the air cooling further, humidity shifting, sounds thinning slightly as insects quiet or winds change. And these gradual transitions mark the passage of time more reliably than any signal, and soldiers attuned to these cues often know roughly when dawn approaches without ever looking at the sky. And yet, during the deepest part of the night, dawn feels distant, almost abstract, and the camp seems suspended between days, held in a steady pause. And it's in this pause that the Roman camp, after midnight, reveals its true nature, not as a place braced for sudden violence, but as a carefully balanced environment designed to carry large numbers of people through long periods of inactivity without strain. And this balance depends on countless small factors working together: the layout of tents, the management of sound, the expectations surrounding movement and rest, and the shared understanding that these hours are meant for recovery, not productivity. And as you remain here, listening to the subtle symphony of canvas, breath, wind, and distant life, the camp feels less like a temporary military installation and more like a quiet, self-contained world, existing briefly in the dark before the next cycle begins, and the hours continue to pass gently, without incident, fulfilling their purpose simply by being uneventful, allowing both body and mind to settle into the slow rhythm that carries the Roman army through night after night, across years of service and countless miles, supported not by drama, but by the calm persistence of ordinary sound and stillness. As the night deepens and the camp settles fully into rest, the experience of sleep itself becomes an important part of understanding how Roman soldiers lived, because rest in a legion camp was never a single, uninterrupted event, but rather a series of gentle descents and brief awakenings, shaped by environment, habit, and necessity. And within the tents, soldiers arrange themselves in ways that reflect long familiarity with shared space. Bedrolls laid side by side, cloaks folded or wrapped carefully to provide warmth and padding, personal items placed close enough to reach in the dark without searching. And while conditions vary depending on season and location, the basic arrangement remains consistent, simple, and functional. And it's worth noting that Roman soldiers did not sleep in full armour, despite popular imagery, but instead removed heavy equipment before resting, keeping only what might be needed quickly nearby, because comfort, even modest comfort, was understood to preserve strength over time. And sandals were often loosened or removed entirely, feet positioned carefully, because foot health was critical and rest offered one of the few chances to recover from the constant strain of marching. And within this shared space, sleep comes gradually, not all at once, with some soldiers drifting off quickly while others remain awake a little longer, listening to the quiet sounds of the camp. And this staggered pattern is normal, even expected, because fatigue affects people differently, and, over time, the body learns not to demand perfect conditions in order to rest, and instead accepts what is available, settling into sleep when it can, and waking lightly when disturbed. And this lightness of sleep is not seen as a flaw, but as an adaptation, because being able to wake briefly without fully surfacing allows soldiers to remain aware without becoming alert, a balance that supports both rest and readiness. And interruptions are common but rarely disruptive. A guard passing nearby, someone shifting position, a distant sound beyond the camp. And rather than reacting with frustration, most soldiers simply adjust and return to sleep, having learned that resistance only prolongs wakefulness. And this acceptance extends to physical discomfort as well, because bedrolls offer limited cushioning and ground conditions vary. Yet over time, the body adapts, finding familiar pressure points, settling into positions that distribute weight evenly. And these small adjustments are made almost unconsciously, reflecting a deep familiarity with one's own limits. And within the tent, the shared nature of rest creates a subtle sense of connection, not emotional in an overt way, but practical, because everyone depends on the same rhythms, and respect for others' rest becomes second nature, movements minimized, voices avoided, personal needs anticipated earlier in the evening to prevent disruption. And this mutual consideration is one of the quiet social bonds formed through long service, reinforcing trust without conversation. And as sleep deepens, it often arrives in layers, with lighter phases broken by deeper moments when awareness fades almost entirely. And dreams, when they occur, are rarely vivid or dramatic, shaped instead by repetition and familiarity, fragments of marches, familiar faces, simple scenes from home. And these dreams tend to pass quickly, giving way to wakefulness just long enough to adjust position before rest resumes. And over the course of the night, this cycle repeats many times, producing rest not through duration, but through accumulation. Small periods of recovery stacked together, and the Roman military system accounted for this, structuring days to allow for such fragmented rest, understanding that soldiers function best when allowed to follow these natural rhythms rather than forcing strict patterns. And for those on watch earlier, sleep may come later, deeper from accumulated fatigue, while others may wake earlier, sensing the subtle changes in the air that signal time passing. And throughout it all, the camp remains quiet enough to support rest but alive enough to prevent disorientation, a balance carefully maintained through planning and habit. And it's here that one of the less obvious strengths of the Roman army becomes clear, which is its ability to normalize conditions that might otherwise feel uncomfortable or stressful, turning shared rest into a stabilizing force rather than a vulnerability. And as the night continues, the tents hold their occupants gently, canvas walls softening sounds, the earth beneath offering steady support, and the collective breathing of many individuals creates a rhythm that blends into the background. And for each soldier, sleep during these hours is less about escape and more about maintenance, a quiet resetting of the body and mind that allows the long sequence of days to continue without collapse. And as you remain within this space, observing the calm persistence of rest unfolding in fragments. It becomes easier to understand how such an army could endure for decades, because endurance is built not on moments of intensity, but on the ability to rest under ordinary conditions, night after night, accepting imperfection, finding calm within routine, and allowing sleep to arrive gently when it will, carrying the camp steadily toward the quiet hours before dawn. As the night continues and the camp remains settled in its deepest quiet, the focus shifts inward toward the thoughts that tend to surface when there is little left to do and nowhere in particular to go, because for Roman soldiers, the hours of darkness often created a mental space unlike any other part of the day, one shaped by stillness, low light, and the absence of immediate demands, and it is during these hours that the mind, no longer occupied with marching, digging, or instruction, begins to move more freely, drifting through memories, impressions, and familiar concerns. And this inward movement is rarely dramatic, more often gentle and repetitive, reflecting the same rhythms that define daily life in the camp. And for many soldiers, thoughts of home emerge naturally, not as sharp longing, but as quiet recollection, images of ordinary places rather than grand moments, a familiar road, a courtyard, the sound of water nearby, or the arrangement of a room remembered through habit rather than detail, and these memories are not always tied to emotion in the way modern storytelling suggests, because long service changes how memory functions, softening edges, turning once vivid experiences into calm reference points that exist alongside the present rather than pulling against it. And it is common for soldiers to think not about specific people, but about routines they once knew, meals prepared in a certain way, seasonal patterns, the feel of work done at a slower pace. And these thoughts provide a sense of continuity, reminding them that life exists beyond the camp, even as the camp defines their present, and alongside memories of home, there are also reflections shaped by repetition, because soldiers who have served for years develop a unique relationship with time, one that measures progress not in days or weeks, but in cycles, the building of camps, the changing of watches, the passing of seasons, and during the quiet of night, this cyclical sense of time becomes more apparent, with thoughts looping gently, returning to familiar observations without urgency. And rather than questioning this repetition, many soldiers come to accept it as the structure of their lives, finding calm in the predictability. And this acceptance is not resignation, but adaptation, a way of conserving mental energy in an environment where change is slow and often outside individual control. And as the mind drifts, it may settle briefly on practical matters, the condition of equipment, the distance yet to march, the state of supplies. But these thoughts rarely linger, because there is little that can be done about them at night, and so they pass, replaced by simpler awareness, the sensation of warmth under a cloak, the sound of breathing nearby, the quiet presence of others resting in close proximity. And this shared environment influences thought as well, because solitude in a Roman camp is rare, and the constant proximity of others shapes a mental landscape that is less introspective and more communal, even in silence. And thoughts often arise without the expectation of privacy, flowing gently rather than deeply. And this may be one reason why many Roman soldiers left few personal written records, because reflection was often internal and transient, experienced in moments like these rather than preserved. And another unfamiliar aspect of Roman military life that becomes clearer during these quiet hours is the way identity shifts over time, because soldiers serving long terms often begin to think of themselves less in terms of their origins and more in terms of their role, their unit, their daily function, and this shift happens gradually, without deliberate intention, reinforced by routine and shared experience. And at night, when the mind has space to wander, This identity feels settled rather than questioned, simply accepted as the current shape of life. And for newer soldiers, thoughts may still turn toward comparison, the difference between past and present. But for veterans, comparison fades, replaced by familiarity. And it is in this quiet mental settling that the Roman camp reveals itself not just as a physical structure, but as a psychological environment, one that shapes how people think by limiting extremes, discouraging intense emotion, and rewarding steadiness. And this does not mean that soldiers lack feeling, but that feelings are absorbed into routine rather than expressed openly. And during the night, when expression is unnecessary, the mind rests in this neutrality, neither excited nor distressed, and it is also during these hours that some soldiers reflect on the passage of years, not in a linear way, but through accumulated impressions, noticing how certain tasks feel easier now, how movements have become automatic, how expectations have shifted, and these reflections are rarely framed as loss or gain, simply as change, observed without judgment, and the absence of external stimulation allows this observation to occur without pressure, and as the mind drifts, it often returns to the present moment naturally, guided by sensory input, the weight of the body against the ground, the texture of fabric, the steady rhythm of breath, and this grounding prevents thoughts from becoming overwhelming, keeping them light and transient, and over time, soldiers learn to trust this process, allowing thoughts to come and go without resistance, a skill that supports mental endurance as much as physical training supports the body. And as the night continues, these inward moments blend seamlessly with rest, thoughts fading into sleep and returning briefly before fading again, forming a gentle pattern that carries the individual through the dark hours without strain. And it is in these quiet mental rhythms that the Roman soldier's inner life unfolds most fully, not in speeches or declarations, but in simple awareness, memory, and acceptance, all held within the calm structure of the camp, moving slowly toward morning without urgency, supported by routine and the shared stillness of those nearby. Long before anyone inside the camp thinks about waking, subtle changes begin to move through the space, almost unnoticed, carried not by human activity, but by the environment itself, because weather, temperature, and the natural world play a constant, understated role in shaping every night a Roman legion spends in the field. And these influences are felt more than they are observed, sensed through the body rather than the eyes. And for soldiers who have lived this life for years, such changes are familiar companions rather than interruptions. And one of the first things that shifts is the air, which cools steadily after midnight, settling closer to the ground, collecting in low places, and moving gently through the camp's straight roads and narrow gaps between tents. And Roman soldiers were keenly aware of this cooling, not as a forecast of discomfort, but as information, because temperature told them where to place bedrolls, how tightly to wrap cloaks, and whether condensation might form on equipment by morning. And over time, these decisions became instinctive, guided by sensation rather than calculation. And when the night is damp, canvas tents absorb moisture slowly, releasing faint smells of earth and fabric. And soldiers learn to position their belongings to avoid contact with the ground, propping shields or packs just slightly higher to keep them dry, habits passed along quietly through observation rather than instruction. And rain, when it comes, alters the camp in predictable ways, drumming softly against canvas, flowing through drainage trenches that were dug earlier in the day with practiced efficiency. And these trenches, often overlooked in dramatic accounts, are one of the most important features of a Roman camp, because they prevent standing water, reduce disease, and preserve sleeping areas, and their effectiveness becomes most evident during the night, when rain might fall for hours without anyone needing to rise to address it, a testament to the foresight built into camp construction. And in colder seasons, the night air carries a different quality, sharper, heavier, encouraging stillness. And soldiers respond by adjusting layers rather than seeking warmth from fires, which are usually avoided at this hour because open flames disrupt rest and introduce risk, and instead warmth is managed through shared proximity. Cloaks pulled closer, bedrolls positioned to block drafts, and these adjustments are made quietly, often without fully waking, reflecting a deep bodily understanding of the environment. And during warmer months, the night brings its own challenges, particularly insects, which gather around any remaining sources of warmth or moisture, and Roman soldiers developed practical responses to this as well, using smoke earlier in the evening to discourage pests, choosing sleeping positions carefully, and accepting a certain level of discomfort as unavoidable, because resistance only heightened awareness. And this acceptance is a recurring theme in camp life, because environmental conditions are rarely ideal, and learning to coexist with them rather than struggle against them conserves energy. And beyond the immediate discomforts, weather also influences the soundscape of the camp, wind altering how noise travels, rain masking distant sounds, cold sharpening them, and guards on watch are particularly attentive to these shifts, adjusting their expectations accordingly, because what sounds unusual on a still night may be ordinary during wind or rain. And this sensitivity to context is learned slowly, built through repeated exposure rather than formal training. And inside the camp, most soldiers remain asleep or resting lightly, but even in rest, the body continues to respond to these changes, adjusting posture, breathing, and position unconsciously, and these small adaptations accumulate, allowing individuals to wake without stiffness or strain, better prepared for the demands of the coming day. And it's worth noting that Roman military planning accounted for seasonal variation in a way that modern audiences often overlook, because campaigns were often timed to avoid the harshest conditions, and when avoidance was impossible, routines adjusted subtly rather than dramatically. Meals altered, marching distances shortened, rest periods extended, and during the night, these adjustments manifest quietly in how people sleep and how the camp holds itself together. And for soldiers stationed in one region for extended periods, familiarity with local climate becomes second nature. Knowing when frost is likely, how fog behaves in certain valleys, how storms tend to pass, and this knowledge reduces uncertainty, replacing fear of the unknown with expectation. And expectation, even of discomfort, is easier to live with than surprise. And as the night progresses, the environment continues its slow movement toward dawn, though dawn itself remains distant. Humidity shifts, insects quiet or grow louder, wind changes direction, and these transitions mark time in a way that clocks never could, and soldiers attuned to these cues often sense when the night has passed its deepest point, even without conscious awareness. And yet, there is no rush, no anticipation that disrupts rest, because morning routines will unfold gradually, just as evening did, and the camp remains in balance, shaped by forces both human and natural. And this balance is one of the Roman army's quiet strengths, its ability to exist comfortably within changing environments by adjusting habits rather than resisting conditions. And as you observe this interplay between camp and weather, it becomes clear that Roman military life was not insulated from nature, but deeply integrated with it, relying on understanding rather than control. And this understanding allowed thousands of soldiers to rest night after night in unfamiliar landscapes without anxiety, trusting that the systems in place, from drainage trenches to shared habits, would carry them through whatever the night brought. And as these subtle environmental rhythms continue, the camp remains steady, neither disturbed nor strained, simply existing within the world around it, allowing the hours to pass gently, supported by adaptation, routine, and the quiet acceptance of conditions beyond anyone's control. Authority within a Roman legion camp reveals itself most clearly when nothing is happening, because discipline here is not performed through spectacle or constant correction, but through an almost invisible framework that guides behavior even in the absence of oversight. And during the late hours of the night, this framework becomes especially apparent, as officers move quietly through familiar paths, not to assert power, but to confirm that the system itself is holding. And Roman military discipline at night functions less like enforcement and more like maintenance, a series of small, consistent actions that keep everything aligned without drawing attention to themselves. And one of the first things to understand is that officers were expected to model calm rather than command it, particularly after dark, because raised voices or sudden movement disrupted rest and created confusion. And so leadership during these hours was deliberately understated, carried out through presence and timing rather than instruction. And as an officer passes along the camp's central roads, his movement is unhurried, predictable, and easily recognized. And this recognition matters because soldiers resting nearby do not need to wonder who is moving through the shadows, and uncertainty is reduced simply by familiarity. And it's here that Roman discipline shows one of its quieter strengths, which is the emphasis on clarity over control, making sure everyone knows what is expected long before the night arrives, so that enforcement becomes largely unnecessary. And this expectation extends to nearly every aspect of camp life, from where soldiers may move at night, to how equipment is stored, and even to how conversations are conducted, because excessive noise is discouraged not by threat, but by shared understanding that rest benefits everyone, and this shared understanding is reinforced daily through routine until it becomes internalized, and soldiers correct themselves without thinking, adjusting behavior automatically in response to environment rather than instruction. And when issues do arise, they are often addressed later, in daylight, because Roman commanders understood that nighttime corrections carried greater risk of misunderstanding, and that most errors made at night were the result of fatigue rather than intent, and so patience was valued over immediacy, a principle that helped preserve morale over long campaigns. And this approach challenges the common image of Roman discipline as uniformly harsh, because while punishments did exist and could be severe, they were applied selectively and strategically, not constantly, and especially not during the hours meant for rest. And in fact, nighttime discipline relied heavily on trust, trusting that soldiers would follow routines because they had done so hundreds of times before, and that trust was reinforced by the structure of the camp itself, which limited opportunities for disorder by design. And another unfamiliar aspect of Roman authority is how responsibility was distributed, because discipline was not centralized entirely in high-ranking officers, but shared among smaller units, with junior leaders responsible for small groups, ensuring that issues were resolved close to where they arose. And this decentralization meant that most corrections were minor and informal, a quiet reminder, a gesture, a look, rather than a formal reprimand. And this subtlety allowed the camp to remain calm even when problems occurred, preventing small disruptions from escalating into larger disturbances. And during the night, this system becomes particularly effective because fewer people are active, and those who are tend to be experienced, familiar with expectations, and capable of self-regulation, and officers on duty focus less on finding faults and more on confirming normalcy, checking that guards are present, that pathways remain clear, that no unexpected activity is unfolding, and most of the time, these checks confirm exactly what they expect, that the camp is quiet, orderly, and at rest. And this confirmation is not trivial because it reassures leadership that the systems put in place during the day are functioning as intended. And this reassurance allows officers themselves to relax slightly, knowing that constant vigilance is unnecessary, and this relaxed vigilance is one of the hallmarks of effective Roman command, maintaining awareness without tension. And it's also important to note that Roman discipline at night included an understanding of human limits, acknowledging that fatigue affects judgment, and that errors made under exhaustion are better addressed through prevention than punishment. And so schedules are arranged to avoid overburdening individuals, watch rotations are kept predictable, and expectations are calibrated to what can reasonably be maintained. And this realism contributes to the camp's overall stability because soldiers feel supported rather than pressured, and as a result, compliance is more consistent, and the camp remains orderly, not because fear is present, but because routine is trusted, and during the quiet hours, this trust becomes almost tangible, felt in the absence of conflict, in the ease with which people move when they must, and in the way minor issues resolve themselves without intervention. And this atmosphere of quiet authority also shapes how soldiers perceive leadership over time, fostering respect rooted in reliability rather than intimidation. And this respect reinforces discipline more effectively than constant enforcement ever could. And as the night continues, officers complete their rounds, often returning to rest themselves, confident that the systems will continue to function without direct oversight. And this confidence is not misplaced because the camp's structure, routines, and shared expectations carry it forward. And in this way, Roman military discipline reveals itself not as a series of dramatic acts, but as a steady presence woven into daily life, especially at night, when the absence of activity makes its effectiveness most visible. And as you observe this quiet order, it becomes clear that the Roman army's ability to endure depended not on relentless control, but on a carefully balanced approach to authority, one that valued predictability, patience, and trust, allowing thousands of individuals to coexist in close quarters without friction, night after night, sustained by a system that worked best when it remained largely unnoticed. Well before the first light appears, long before anyone thinks of the day as having begun, the camp starts to change in ways so subtle they're felt more than noticed, because the approach of morning in a Roman legion camp is not marked by a sudden awakening, but by a gradual shift in atmosphere, a soft loosening of the stillness that has held everything together through the night. And this transition unfolds slowly, guided by routine rather than signals. And for soldiers who have lived this pattern for months or years, the signs are unmistakable even without looking at the sky. The air carries a slightly different weight, cooler but less heavy. Sounds travel differently, and the deep quiet of the night begins to thin, not replaced by noise, but by potential, a sense that movement will soon return. And among the first to feel this change are the guards nearing the end of their final watch, whose awareness sharpens not because of urgency, but because the task is almost complete, and their steps, though still unhurried, carry a quiet sense of closure as they complete familiar routes one last time, listening for anything out of place, not expecting trouble, but confirming that the night has passed as it should. And as these guards prepare to be relieved, the exchange is brief and understated, a simple acknowledgement, a shared understanding that no report is needed because nothing requires explanation. And this absence of incident is the desired outcome, signaling that the systems of the camp have functioned correctly, and as guards return toward their tents, they do so quietly, blending back into rest rather than drawing attention to themselves, because the camp does not yet belong to the day, and inside the tents, small movements begin to ripple outward, not as coordinated action, but as individual responses to the changing environment. Someone shifts position, another adjusts a cloak, a third sits up briefly before lying back down. And these movements are rarely conscious decisions, more often the body responding to cues it has learned to recognize. And this semi-waking state is common in camp life, because rest has come in fragments, and the mind drifts easily between sleep and awareness. And for many soldiers, these early moments before dawn are among the calmest of the day, free from demands, free from expectation, existing in a quiet interval between rest and responsibility. And, as time continues to pass, a few fires are gently revived, not fully lit, but coaxed back into warmth with care, providing just enough heat to take the edge off the morning chill. And those tending these fires do so without conversation. Movements slow and economical, because there is no need to hurry. The day will arrive, whether they rush or not. And nearby, water is quietly prepared for washing or drinking, containers checked, placed where they will be needed soon. And these preparations are made by habit rather than instruction, reflecting a shared understanding of what comes next. And as more soldiers stir, the camp remains subdued, voices low, gestures minimal, because this early hour is reserved for transition, not activity. And it's here that the Roman camp's strength in managing large groups becomes especially clear, because thousands of individuals begin to wake without creating disorder, guided by the same internal clock shaped by routine and repetition. And officers, when they appear at all, do so unobtrusively, observing rather than directing, because most of what needs to happen will happen without prompting, and this trust in the process reduces friction, allowing the camp to move smoothly from night to day. And as the eastern horizon lightens almost imperceptibly, the camp's shape becomes clearer again, tents emerging from shadow, roads reappearing as familiar lines, and this visual clarity reinforces orientation, grounding soldiers as they prepare mentally for the day ahead. And yet, even now, nothing feels rushed, because Roman military life values sequence over speed, and each step unfolds in its proper time, and this pacing preserves energy and focus, ensuring that when movement resumes fully, it does so from a place of steadiness rather than strain. And as the night officially ends, though no signal announces it, the camp completes another cycle, having passed through darkness without disruption, and this quiet success is absorbed without comment, because it is expected. And as the camp prepares to re-enter the routines of daylight, the lingering calm of the early morning remains, carrying forward the sense of continuity that defines life in a Roman legion, where each day begins not with excitement, but with familiarity, and where the smooth passage from night to morning is simply another sign that the system is working as intended, steady, reliable, and ready to repeat itself once more. When you step back from this single night and allow it to blend into all the others that came before and after, what begins to emerge is a broader understanding of how the Roman legion endured for so long, not through constant action or dramatic moments, but through the quiet accumulation of ordinary nights, like this one, repeated thousands of times across decades and continents. Because for most soldiers, military life was not defined by battle, but by routine, by the steady rhythm of building camps, sharing simple meals, standing watch, resting in fragments, and waking again to do it all once more. And this repetition, shaped not only the structure of the army, but the people within it, gradually smoothing extremes, encouraging patience, and teaching individuals how to exist within systems larger than themselves without constant strain. And when historians speak of Roman discipline or organization, it's easy to imagine something rigid or oppressive. But nights like this reveal a different reality, one where order serves to reduce mental effort rather than increase it, freeing soldiers from the burden of constant decision-making and allowing them to conserve energy for the long duration of service. And it's also worth remembering that many of these soldiers served for 20 years or more, spending the majority of their adult lives moving between camps, roads, and frontier posts. And over time, the camp itself became a kind of temporary home, not because it was comfortable in a modern sense, but because it was familiar, and familiarity has a calming power that should not be underestimated, especially in uncertain environments. And through this lens, the Roman legion camp after dark appears less as a military installation and more as a carefully balanced living system, designed to support human needs quietly and consistently. And this balance explains much of Rome's endurance, because systems that accommodate ordinary human limits tend to last longer than those that rely on constant intensity. And as nights passed uneventfully, soldiers learned to trust the routines that carried them forward, trusting that the camp would hold its shape, that watches would change smoothly, that rest would come in pieces if not all at once, and that morning would arrive without urgency. And this trust reduced anxiety, allowing individuals to focus on what was immediately in front of them rather than what might happen next. And over time, this focus created a culture where waiting was not wasted time, but part of the work itself. And this perspective challenges many modern assumptions about war and strength, because it suggests that resilience comes not from excitement or heroism, but from the ability to remain steady through long periods of quiet. And as you imagine this camp now, existing briefly in the dark before fading into another day, it becomes easier to see the Roman army not as a collection of extraordinary individuals, but as a vast number of ordinary people supported by systems that made ordinary life sustainable under unusual circumstances, and these systems extended beyond architecture and discipline into the rhythms of sleep, thought, and rest, shaping how soldiers experience time itself, smoothing sharp edges, and creating continuity where none might otherwise exist. And this continuity allowed the empire to function across generations, because each soldier inherited routines refined by those before him, participating in a pattern already proven to work. And when one night ended and another began, nothing needed to be reinvented, only repeated, and repetition, when designed well, becomes a source of calm rather than monotony. And as this final night fades into memory, joining countless others like it, the enduring image is not one of tension or conflict, but of quiet persistence, of people moving through familiar motions under a wide, dark sky, supported by simple structures, shared habits, and an understanding that most of life, even in war, is lived in moments that pass without notice. And as you rest with that thought, allowing it to settle gently, you may find that the stillness of this Roman camp mirrors the stillness of your own surroundings now, both held together by routine, by the passage of time, and by the quiet assurance that nothing more is required in this moment. And if you've made it all the way to the end of this story and found it calming or interesting to spend time here, you're always welcome to subscribe and join us again as new stories like this are shared each week. And until then, the camp remains behind you, settled and complete. Another ordinary night finished, another calm cycle carried forward, fading softly into rest.